In Part 1, we explored Ned Kelly's early life, his Irish roots, childhood struggles, and the circumstances that set him on the path to crime. Part 2 delved into the rise of the Kelly gang, their escalating conflicts with the police, and the dramatic events that led to them becoming outlaws. For a deeper understanding of Ned Kelly's journey, we strongly recommend watching Part 1 and Part 2 before continuing with Part 3. Now, we follow the gang as they remain on the run, carry out daring robberies, and challenge the law like never before, pushing their reputation and defiance to new heights. In the rugged bushland of Greta, Ned Kelly, once Harry Power's apprentice, now a hardened outlaw, found himself at the center of relentless police scrutiny. With two of his brothers already branded as jailbirds, the authorities seemed determined to pin every crime in the district on him. But Ned was far from alone. The Greta Mob, a tight-knit group of young men bound by loyalty and a shared defiance of authority, included 19-year-old Tom Lloyd Jr., Ned's cousin and trusted ally, Dan Kelly's friend, Stephen Hart, who lived with his parents on a 53-acre selection near Wangaratta, and 21-year-old Aaron Sherritt, whose frequent run-ins with the law had made him a marked man. A new force within the gang was Aaron's childhood friend, Joe Byrne, a strikingly different figure from the rest. Intelligent, better educated than most bush lads, and possessing a sharp mind, Joe had grown up in the Woolshed Valley, where he lived among Chinese gold diggers. He spoke fluent Cantonese, a rare skill among bushrangers, and had also acquired an addiction to opium. At 5'10", a fine horseman and a deadly marksman, Joe was more than just another member of the gang. He was the strategist, the calculating mind that Ned needed to push their defiance to the next level. As their notoriety grew, so did the determination of the wealthy squatters in the district to rid themselves of the Greta Mob. These men, with their tilted cabbage tree hats pulled low to obscure their faces, were no longer just local troublemakers. They were a direct challenge to law and order. Their very appearance became a symbol of defiance, with chin straps worn not under the chin, but under the nose, making them even harder to identify. For nearly 3 years, Ned had attempted to carve a more lawful path, but by 1877, circumstances had forced him back into what he wryly called wholesale and retail horse and cattle dealing. This was no small-scale operation. It was a systematic, near-industrial theft ring. Alongside Ellen Kelly's new husband, George King, Joe Byrne, Aaron Sherritt, Isaiah Wild Wright, and Bricky Williamson, Ned had built a network that moved stolen livestock with precision, outpacing the authorities at every turn. By now, the Victorian police had had enough. Superintendent Charles Nicholson, the second highest-ranking police officer in the colony, set his sights on the northeast, determined to crush the Greta gang. The police strategy was simple: find any excuse to put the Kellys and their associates behind bars. It was a turning point. The tension between the law and the soon-to-be outlaws had reached a breaking point, and the hunt for Ned Kelly was about to take a dangerous new turn. By the 1870s, Benalla had grown into a thriving township along the banks of the Broken River, serving as a crucial stop on the Melbourne-Sydney route. The town had already witnessed its share of history. In 1838, the Faithful Massacre saw the violent clash between European settlers and Aboriginal people, resulting in the deaths of 8 station workers, one of many bloody conflicts marking the frontier wars of early settlement. Even earlier, in 1836, Benalla had been the site of another tragedy when James Taylor, the bugler from Major Mitchell's exploration team, drowned while attempting to cross the Broken River. A grim reminder of the perils faced by early explorers. By the 1870s, however, Benalla was no longer just a place of past conflicts. It had become a bustling rural town, complete with hotels, businesses, and a growing railway network linking it to the wider colony of Victoria. On the 18th of September, 1877, Kelly was arrested in Benalla for riding over a footpath while drunk. Ned suspected the police of spiking his liquor, as he was with Constable Fitzpatrick at the bar on the night in question. Ned treated Constable Alexander Fitzpatrick as a friend who entered the police force just 6 months before. 4 police constables were escorting Ned to the Benalla courthouse. The trouble started when Fitzpatrick suggested they put handcuffs on Ned. Darby's was another word used for handcuffs on those days, the name of the company that made them. "You won't put Darby's on me without a fight," Ned yelled. Furious with the police, he broke away from the police and escaped to the bootmaker's shop across the road. The 4 police escorts, Sergeant Whelan, Constables Fitzpatrick, Day and Lonergan followed in hot pursuit, and a violent brawl ensued, police assisted by King, the bootmaker. In the fracas, Ned knocked down Constable Fitzpatrick, and in turn was grabbed by Constable Lonergan in his privates. Ned was said to have howled in pain, yelling, "Well, Lonergan, I never shot a man yet, but if I do so, help me God, you will be the first." It was indeed Lonergan that Ned was to kill at Stringy Bark, but Ned failed to recognize him. Ned fought like the devil against his prosecutors, and only agreed to surrender after sympathetic Justice of Peace William Magennis convinced Ned to accompany him to the courthouse. It was yet another run-in with the law, but this time, it marked the beginning of a deepening enmity between Ned Kelly and the police. A conflict that would soon spiral into something far more dangerous. Ned Kelly wasn't the only one who walked away bruised from the scuffle. During the brawl, he hurled Constable Fitzpatrick against the wall with such force that the young officer was left shaken and humiliated. For Fitzpatrick, this was more than just an altercation, it was a personal score that needed settling. That same day, Ned faced swift repercussions. He was charged with assaulting police in the execution of their duty, and fined £2 or 1 month in jail, plus 5 shillings for the damage to Fitzpatrick's clothing. But the penalties didn't stop there. He was also convicted of resisting arrest, and given an additional £2 fine, or another month behind bars. The authorities were tightening their grip, and with each encounter, the tension between the Kellys and the police escalated further. By August 1877, Ned and his associate George King had turned horse theft into a lucrative trade. That month, they sold 6 stolen horses, taken from wealthy pastoralist James Whitty to a horse dealer named William Baumgarten in Barnawartha. But their dealings soon unraveled. On the 10th of November, 1877, Baumgarten was arrested for selling the stolen horses, and the law began closing in on the true culprits. Arrest warrants for Ned and Dan Kelly were sworn in March and April 1878, setting the stage for yet another confrontation between the Kellys and the authorities. On the 11th of April, 1878, Constable Strachan of Greta received word that Ned was hiding out at a shearing shed across the border in New South Wales. Determined to capture him, he left immediately in pursuit. Just 4 days later, on the 15th of April, Constable Alexander Fitzpatrick, now stationed at Greta, saw an opportunity to settle his old grudge. Ignoring a direct order from Superintendent Charles Nicholson, which required at least 2 officers to visit the Kelly homestead, Fitzpatrick rode out alone to arrest Dan Kelly for horse theft. His past friendship with Ned, along with his eagerness to claim the glory of capturing one of the Kelly brothers, led him to take a reckless gamble, one that would have devastating consequences. Upon arriving at the Kelly homestead, Constable Fitzpatrick found that Dan Kelly was not at home. Rather than leaving, he lingered, striking up a conversation with Ellen Kelly, who was nursing her newborn daughter, Alice, born just 2 days earlier. As the evening wore on, Dan returned home accompanied by his brother-in-law, Bill Skillion. The moment Fitzpatrick saw Dan, he informed him that he was under arrest. Dan, unfazed, requested permission to have dinner first. Fitzpatrick, perhaps believing he had the situation under control, agreed and stood watch as Dan prepared to eat. But there was a glaring problem. Fitzpatrick had arrived without a warrant. When questioned, he simply stated that a telegram from Chilton had informed him of a warrant for Dan's arrest. This did not sit well with Ellen Kelly, who immediately protested. In her eyes, this was yet another case of police harassment, and she refused to let Fitzpatrick take her son without proper legal authority. That was when the situation spiraled out of control. Within minutes, the tense standoff exploded into violence. Ned Kelly suddenly stormed into the room and fired a shot at Fitzpatrick, narrowly missing him. Before the constable could react, Ellen struck him over the head with a fire shovel. A fierce struggle ensued, during which Ned fired again, this time wounding Fitzpatrick above his left wrist. As Fitzpatrick reeled from the attack, Skillion and their family friend, William Williamson, rushed in, revolvers drawn. Dan quickly seized the opportunity to disarm the injured constable, leaving him defenseless. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Ned quickly changed his tone. He apologized to Fitzpatrick, claiming he had mistaken him for another officer. Ellen then tended to the wounded constable, dressing his injury, while Ned devised a cover story to keep the incident from escalating further. He promised Fitzpatrick a reward if he stuck to the agreed version of events. Having little choice, Fitzpatrick agreed, and the gang allowed him to leave. However, as Fitzpatrick rode away, he glanced over his shoulder and saw Skillion and Williamson in pursuit. Fearing for his life, he spurred his horse into a desperate gallop. Roughly 1.5 kilometers away, he reached a hotel where his wound was hastily rebandaged. From there, he pressed on to Benalla to report the attack, setting off a chain of events that would seal the fate of the Kelly family. The truth about the Fitzpatrick incident remains one of the most debated moments in the Kelly saga. In the aftermath, conflicting accounts emerged from both sides, further fueling the legend of Ned Kelly. From the beginning, Kelly denied any involvement. He initially claimed he had been away from Greta at the time and that if Fitzpatrick had suffered any injuries, they were likely self-inflicted. Fitzpatrick's reputation did little to help his credibility. He was widely known as a womanizer, with a strong appetite for both alcohol and the company of women. In 1879, Kelly's sister, Kate, added another layer to the controversy, alleging that Ned shot Fitzpatrick only after the constable had made an improper advance toward her. However, when Kelly was finally captured in 1880, he dismissed this as a foolish story. Yet, the police had their own version. During Kelly's trial, 3 officers swore under oath that Ned had admitted to shooting Fitzpatrick. Regardless of the conflicting testimonies, the law came down hard on the Kelly family. Ellen Kelly, Williamson, and Skillion were all arrested and charged with aiding and abetting the attempted murder of Fitzpatrick. By then, Ned and Dan Kelly had vanished into the bush, evading capture. The trial took place on the 9th of October, 1878, before Judge Redmond Barry, a man whose name would become forever tied to Ned Kelly's fate. Judge Barry delivered a harsh verdict. Ellen Kelly was sentenced to 3 years of hard labor, while Skillion and Williamson each received 6 years in prison. Their fate was sealed, but out in the bush, Ned and Dan Kelly had only just begun their war against the law. After the Fitzpatrick incident, Ned and Dan Kelly vanished into the bush, evading capture and outmaneuvering the authorities. They were soon joined by Joe Byrne and Steve Hart, fellow members of the Greta mob. Their refuge was deep in the Wombat Ranges, at Bullock Creek, where they had camped during past summers. Here, they carved out a rugged existence, sustaining themselves through gold sluicing and whiskey distillation, all while being supplied with provisions and intelligence by a growing network of sympathizers. Determined to secure their hideout, they enclosed 20 acres with fencing on 3 sides to protect their stolen horses. They also planted 2 crops, mangel wurzels to feed their livestock, and barley, the key ingredient for whiskey production. By sluicing for gold along Bullock Creek, they earned enough money to help fund Ellen Kelly's legal battle against her conviction. Their whiskey-making enterprise was another source of income, with the gang turning the secluded bushland into their own outlaw stronghold. Desperate to track down Ned, the police first attempted to turn Isaiah Wild Wright into an informer. Wright, a skilled horseman and at times an uneasy ally of Ned, made his stance clear: he would not betray Kelly for all the money in Australia. But eventually, the law closed in. Acting on a tip-off, the police sent 2 mounted search parties to flush the gang out of hiding. On the 25th of October, 1878, one of these units, led by Sergeant Michael Kennedy and including Constables Michael Scanlon, Thomas Lonergan, and Thomas McIntyre, set up camp at an abandoned mining site at Stringybark Creek, 36 kilometers north of Mansfield. Disguised as prospectors, they had no idea that their presence had already been detected. Unbeknownst to the officers, Ned Kelly had spotted their tracks. The police were less than 2.5 kilometers from the gang's hideout, and Ned was already planning his next move. The following day, the 26th of October 1878, at around 5 p.m., the Kelly gang made their move. Sergeant Kennedy and Constable Scanlon had gone scouting, leaving Constables McIntyre and Lonergan alone at the camp. Seizing the opportunity, the gang emerged from the bush and bailed up the two officers. McIntyre, caught unarmed and outnumbered, immediately surrendered. Lonergan, however, reacted differently. He instinctively reached for his revolver and ran for cover behind a log. Before he could fire, Ned Kelly raised his gun and shot him in the right eye, killing him instantly. "I shot him that instant," Ned would later explain, "or he would have shot me." He had no remorse for Lonergan's death, describing him as the meanest man that I had any account against. With one officer dead, the gang turned their attention to McIntyre, questioning him and confiscating the firearms belonging to him and Lonergan. Hoping to appeal to Ned's Irish heritage, McIntyre revealed that Kennedy and Scanlon were also Irish Catholics, hoping this might spare their lives. But Ned, unmoved, coldly replied, "I will let them see what one native can do." At around 5:30 p.m., Kennedy and Scanlon were heard approaching the camp. The gang quickly took cover, and Ned instructed McIntyre to tell them to surrender. As McIntyre called out, the gang sprang from their hiding places, ordering the officers to bail up. Kennedy immediately reached for his revolver. The gang opened fire. Scanlon, caught off guard, tried to dismount and unsling his rifle, but was shot and killed before he could fire a shot, at least according to McIntyre. Ned, however, later insisted that Scanlon had fired first and was attempting to fire again when he shot him dead. Kennedy, now alone, was forced to dismount under heavy gunfire. McIntyre later claimed that Kennedy tried to surrender, but the gang kept shooting. Ned's own version was different. He stated that Kennedy hid behind a tree and fired back before making a desperate run into the bush. The Kelly brothers gave chase, exchanging gunfire with Kennedy over more than a kilometer. Finally, Ned fired a shot that struck Kennedy in the right side, bringing him down. Wounded and defenseless, Kennedy turned to face Ned, at which point Ned fired again, this time into his chest with his shotgun. According to Ned, he had not realized Kennedy had already dropped his revolver and was trying to surrender. Amidst the chaos, McIntyre, still unarmed, saw his chance. Mounting Kennedy's horse, he bolted from the scene, riding through the night until he reached Mansfield the following day. Once there, he raised the alarm, and a search party was quickly dispatched. They found Lonergan and Scanlon's bodies at the camp, but Kennedy's remains were missing. It wasn't until 2 days later that his badly mutilated body was discovered deep in the bush, where he had fallen. In the aftermath, Ned Kelly justified the killings as acts of self-defense. He pointed to reports that police had boasted about their plans to shoot him on sight, the stockpile of weapons and ammunition the officers carried, and their failure to surrender, all, he claimed, proof that they had come to kill him, not arrest him. McIntyre, however, gave a very different account. He insisted that the police's mission was simply to arrest Ned, that they were not excessively armed, and that it was the gang who had ambushed them. The killings had changed everything. Ned Kelly and his gang were now wanted men. They were officially declared murderers. The day after the Stringybark Creek shootings, the Argus reported, "Sub-Inspectors Putras, Dr. Reynolds, Callipy, and others have now left on horseback to scour the country and bring home the dead bodies. The bushrangers are supposed to be the notorious Kelly party, for whom the constables were in search." The search party, after an 8-hour journey from Mansfield, reached Stringybark Creek, and recovered the bodies of Lonergan and Scanlon. However, Sergeant Kennedy was nowhere to be found. Back in Mansfield, Bridget Kennedy, the sergeant's wife, clung to the hope that her husband was still alive. But Sub-Inspector Putris held no such belief. Determined to find Kennedy's remains, he organized a search party consisting of 16 volunteers and 5 constables, who combed the rugged terrain in a methodical sweep. It was only 5 days later that they discovered Kennedy's partially decomposed body, 800 yards north along the creek. The grim recovery confirmed what many already feared: Kennedy had not survived his desperate escape into the bush. For Ned Kelly and his gang, the priority was now clear: put as much distance as possible between themselves and the scene of the killings. With the police closing in, they had no choice but to ride through the night, navigating swollen creeks and treacherous terrain. Their destination was Woolshed Valley, just west of Beechworth, where they sought refuge at the cottage of Aaron Sherritt, a close friend of Joe Byrne. The killings at Stringybark Creek sent shockwaves through Victoria. The Graham Berry government, outraged by the murder of its officers, responded with unprecedented force. Premier Berry made it clear that the hunt for the Kelly gang would be relentless: no shortage of men, no shortage of firepower. The government swiftly announced a reward of £200 for any information leading to the capture of each gang member. It was an unmistakable declaration: Ned Kelly, Dan Kelly, Joe Byrne, and Steve Hart were now the most wanted men in the colony. The Argus mourned the fallen officers, reporting, "The sorrow felt for the death of Scanlon is universal throughout the district. He seems to have been a brave, cool, amiable, excellent man. Kennedy was an efficient bushman and a resolute officer. He has a wife and 5 children, and fortunately for them, should he be killed, his circumstances are good. Scanlon was unmarried, and his station was Benalla. Lonergan was from Violet Town. He has left a widow and 4 children badly off." The township of Mansfield, located 200 kilometers northeast of Melbourne, lies in a wide valley surrounded by mountain ranges. In 1878, Mansfield was a small town with just a handful of general stores, several butchers, and blacksmiths. Public buildings included the Shire Hall and Library, a hospital, 3 churches, and Victoria Hall. On the afternoon of the 1st of November, 1878, Mansfield prepared for what would be the largest procession the town had ever witnessed. Every business closed for the day, and the entire township turned out to farewell Sergeant Michael Kennedy, one of the 3 policemen murdered by the Kelly gang at Stringybark Creek. The Bishop of Melbourne, James Moorhouse, led the solemn procession, flanked by Father Scanlon, the local Catholic priest, and Reverend Sandiford, the Church of England pastor. The police memorial in Mansfield's main street stands as a tribute to the 3 slain constables: Sergeant Michael Kennedy, Constable Thomas Lonergan, and Constable Michael Scanlon. The movement to erect the memorial began on the 21st of December, 1878, just 2 months after the murders. Funded by contributions from the police forces of Victoria and New South Wales, local residents, and the public, the memorial was officially unveiled on the 22nd of April, 1880 by Captain Standish, the Chief Commissioner of Police at the time. The police memorial is located at the intersection of High and Hyatt Streets in Mansfield, standing as a permanent reminder of the brutal events of Stringybark Creek and the loss suffered by the Victorian police force. The public outrage was immediate. Just days after the police killings, on the 30th of October, 1878, the Victorian government escalated its response, raising the reward for the capture of each gang member from £200 to £500, an unprecedented sum at the time. But the government didn't stop there. Determined to put an end to the Kelly gang once and for all, the Parliament of Victoria passed the Felons Apprehension Act on the 1st of November, 1878, a draconian law designed specifically to hunt down and eliminate the outlaws. This new legislation stripped Ned Kelly, Dan Kelly, and their 2 yet unidentified accomplices, Joe Byrne and Steve Hart, of their legal rights. Under the Act, if they failed to surrender by the 12th of November, 1878, they would be declared outlaws, no longer protected by the law, and legally able to be shot on sight by anyone, without warning or a call to surrender. On the 12th of November, the Mansfield courthouse remained open all day, waiting for the gang to turn themselves in. But no one came. 3 days later, on the 15th of November, 1878, Ned Kelly, Dan Kelly, Joe Byrne, and Steve Hart were officially proclaimed outlaws, the first in Victoria's history. The government had now given police and civilians alike the legal right to kill them on sight. When this happened, Ned Kelly was just 23 years old. Dan was only 17. The colony had drawn its battle lines. The hunt for the Kelly gang had begun. The Felons Apprehension Act did more than just declare the Kelly gang outlaws. It also targeted anyone who dared to support them. Under the law, anyone who provided aid, shelter, or sustenance to the gang, or withheld or gave false information to the authorities, faced severe consequences. The punishment: up to 15 years in prison, with or without hard labor. This harsh legislation was not without precedent. The Victorian Act was modelled on the 1865 Felons Apprehension Act of New South Wales, which had been passed to crack down on notorious bushrangers like Frank Gardner, Ben Hall, and Dan Morgan. Now, with the rise of the Kelly gang, the New South Wales Parliament saw the need to reinforce its own laws. In 1879, they reenacted their Felons Apprehension Act, ensuring that the gang could not find refuge across the border. The message from both colonies was clear: anyone who aided the Kelly gang would suffer the full force of the law. The net was tightening, and with every move, the government was escalating its pursuit. After the Stringybark Creek killings, the Kelly gang attempted to escape into New South Wales, hoping to put the Murray River between themselves and the relentless police pursuit. However, heavy flooding forced them to abandon their plan and retreat back into northeastern Victoria. The police, acting on a credible tip-off, had already anticipated their move. Checkpoints were set up at every major crossing along the Murray River, ensuring that if the gang attempted to cross, they would be intercepted. Despite the dragnet, Ned, Dan, Joe Byrne, and Steve Hart managed to evade capture multiple times, relying on a vast network of sympathizers who provided them with food, shelter, and intelligence on police movements. With their status as outlaws now official, the gang faced a new challenge: money. Their resources were dwindling, and they needed funds to stay ahead of the law. The solution: robbery. The gang set their sights on the National Bank in Euroa. At the time, Euroa was a quiet country township with a population of just 300 people. It sat at the western gateway to northeastern Victoria, surrounded by fertile farmland that sustained the local economy. To the southeast loomed the Strathbogie Ranges, a vast, rugged, heavily timbered wilderness, stretching 40 miles from Benalla in the northeast to Mansfield in the southeast, and Seymour in the southwest. These dense forests provided the perfect cover for outlaws, making the area ideal for a gang on the run. Despite its strategic location, Euroa had minimal law enforcement. The town's police force consisted of just one mounted trooper, Constable Anderson. Other than that, it had a railway station, a couple of pubs, and, crucially, a bank. On the 8th of December, 1878, Joe Byrne, the mastermind behind the planned robbery, arrived in Euroa to conduct reconnaissance. Posing as an ordinary traveler, he visited a pub, ordered a drink and a meal, and casually struck up conversations with the locals. As he listened, he gathered crucial intelligence: the layout of the town, the position of the bank, and any potential obstacles the gang might face. With the groundwork laid, the Kelly gang was ready to strike. Around midday on the 9th of December, 1878, the Kelly gang launched their boldest move yet: the hold-up of Young Husband Station, just outside Euroa. Sprawling across 11,000 acres, Young Husband Station was one of the wealthiest pastoral properties in Victoria, controlled by Isaac Young Husband and Andrew Lyle, a sitting member of the Legislative Assembly. The estate was a symbol of colonial wealth and power, making it a fitting target for Ned Kelly and his gang, who saw themselves as bush rebels striking back at the establishment. The gang took control of the station swiftly, capturing 14 male employees, along with passers-by, and locking them in an outbuilding. The female hostages were held separately in the homestead. Some of the prisoners, however, were hardly terrified. Many were suspected sympathizers, already aware that the Kelly gang was planning a raid. The following morning, Dan Kelly was left in charge of the hostages, while Ned, Joe Byrne, and Steve Hart set out to cut Euroa's telegraph wires, ensuring that no alarm could be raised before their heist was complete. Along the way, they intercepted a hunting party and a group of railway workers, whom they also took hostage and brought back to the station. With the telegraph line severed and Young Husband Station under their control, the gang was ready for the final stage of their plan, the bank robbery itself. Leaving Joe Byrne to guard the captives, Ned, Dan, and Hart set off for Euroa, using a hawker's cart owned by Richard Gloucester, but driven by his assistant, Frank Beecroft. The Kelly gang was about to pull off one of the most audacious robberies in Australian history. Ned Kelly had come prepared. In his hand, he carried a cheque for £1, 4 shillings, signed by Mr. Macaulay, and drawn on the Oriental Bank of Melbourne. This small but crucial detail was part of the plan, an excuse to get inside the National Bank of Australasia in Euroa. The bank stood on Binney Street, just 50 yards from the railway tracks, on the same side of town as Faithful's Creek Station. It was an ideal target. The streets were quiet, with only a handful of pedestrians. Most of the locals were at home, preparing for the funeral of a young man who had died in a tragic fall from his horse. The gang executed their plan with precision. Frank Beecroft, who had been forced to drive the gang's cart, pulled up at the bank's rear entrance as instructed. Meanwhile, Ned Kelly stepped down at the front door and knocked. The plan had been carefully crafted by Ned and Joe Byrne, using inside knowledge provided by hawker Benjamin Gould, the same man who, years earlier, had encouraged Ned to send a pair of calf's testicles to Jeremiah McCormick's wife, sparking an infamous feud. Now, Gould's information was being used for a much bigger score. Inside, bank accountant Edward Bradley was busy tallying the day's accounts when he heard the knock. Ned called out, "I have a check from Mr. Macaulay to cash." But the bank had already closed for the day, and Bradley refused to open the door. Ned was persistent. He knocked again and again. Eventually, Bradley relented, opening the door just enough to see what the stranger wanted. That was all the opportunity Ned needed. He slipped inside, slammed the door shut behind him, and leveled his revolver at the stunned banker. By 4 p.m., Ned, Dan, and Steve Hart had the bank staff at gunpoint. In a swift, well-orchestrated heist, they looted the bank, seizing cash and gold worth £2,260, along with a small number of documents and securities. The bank staff, 14 in total, were taken as hostages and marched back to Young Husband Station, joining the captives already held there. Back at the station, the mood was almost surreal. Rather than simply disappearing into the bush, the Kelly gang put on a trick-riding display, performing stunts on horseback for their 37 captives, as if the robbery had been nothing more than a grand adventure. Finally, at around 8:30 p.m., the gang prepared to leave. But before they vanished into the night, they issued a warning: anyone who attempted to leave within the next 3 hours would suffer reprisals. Then, under the cover of darkness, Ned Kelly and his gang rode off, leaving behind a stunned town and the legend of the Euroa Bank robbery, their first, and one of the most daring heists in Australian history. In the aftermath of the Euroa Bank robbery, the press had much to say. Newspapers across Victoria marvelled at the efficiency and boldness of the raid, a perfectly executed heist that had humiliated the police force. The authorities, once again, had been caught off guard, and the Kelly gang had proven themselves a step ahead. Among the hostages, many reported that Ned Kelly and his gang had acted courteously, avoiding unnecessary violence. However, their restraint did not mean there was no menace. Several captives later testified that the bushrangers had repeatedly threatened to shoot them and burn buildings containing hostages if there was any sign of resistance. The Kelly gang may have been charismatic, but they were also dangerous men, and they made it clear that disobedience would have dire consequences. While still at Young Husband Station, Joe Byrne took to paper, writing 2 copies of a letter dictated by Ned Kelly. The letters, which would later be seen as a precursor to the infamous Jerilderie letter, were sent on the 14th of December, 1878, one addressed to Donald Cameron, a Victorian parliamentarian whom Kelly mistakenly believed to be sympathetic to the gang, and the other to Superintendent John Sadleir, a senior police officer. In this letter, Kelly laid out his version of the Fitzpatrick incident and the Stringy Bark Creek killings, painting himself as a victim of police harassment and corruption. He detailed allegations of misconduct by the authorities, accusing them of oppression, injustice, and brutality against his family. The letter was signed, Edward Kelly, Enforced Outlaw. Kelly had hoped that Donald Cameron would read the letter in Parliament, forcing the government to acknowledge his grievances. But the authorities had no intention of giving him a platform. Instead, only summaries of the letter were made public. The Argus, unimpressed, dismissed it as the work of a clever illiterate. However, even Premier Graham Berry, an outspoken critic of the gang, found the letter very clever. He took particular note of an ominous reference Kelly had made about tearing up railway tracks, a detail that quickly caught the attention of railway authorities. This letter was just the beginning. A year later, in 1879, Kelly would expand upon its contents in what would become his most famous manifesto, the Jerilderie letter. The Euroa Bank robbery had made headlines across the colony, but for Ned Kelly, it was more than just a heist. It was a statement, a direct challenge to the government, the police, and the law itself. By early 1879, the police, frustrated by their inability to capture the Kelly gang, turned their attention to those who supported them. On the 2nd of January, warrants were issued for the arrest of 30 suspected Kelly sympathizers. Of these, 23 were remanded in custody, a move intended to cut off the gang's vital support network. However, the tactic quickly drew criticism. Over a third of those arrested were released within 7 weeks due to a lack of evidence, but 9 men remained behind bars, their remands renewed week after week for nearly 3 months, despite police failing to produce any evidence substantial enough for a committal hearing. The controversial detentions sparked public outcry. Many saw it as a gross abuse of civil liberties, arresting men not for crimes they had committed, but for their supposed association with the outlaws. The backlash reached Ned Kelly, who responded in the only way he knew, with defiance. In a letter to Acting Chief Secretary Brian O'Loughlin, he accused the government of committing a manifest injustice in imprisoning so many innocent people, and warned of violent reprisals if the arrests continued. The police, however, stood by their actions, insisting that the crackdown was necessary to cut off the gang's supply lines and force them into the open. But by the 22nd of April, 1879, the strategy had crumbled. Police Magistrate William Henry Foster rejected the prosecution's requests to extend the remands and ordered the remaining detainees to be released. The police command strongly opposed Foster's decision, but by then, it was clear, the Kelly gang remained at large, their support network unbroken. The authorities had failed, and in the process, they had fueled the legend of Ned Kelly even further. Part 3 of the Ned Kelly series ends here. With the Euroa Bank robbery, the Kelly gang had humiliated the police, defied the government, and strengthened their legend. Despite relentless pursuit, they remained untouchable, their support unbroken. But their defiance could not last forever. In Part 4, we follow the gang to Jerilderie, where Ned Kelly delivers his infamous manifesto, then to Glenrowan, where they make their final, fateful stand. And finally, we witness the capture, trial, and hanging of the outlaw who became both a national icon and a symbol of defiance. Part 4 will come soon, wait for it. The final chapter of Ned Kelly's story is about to unfold.